First, due attribution, the term comes from a Stanford professor of education named Ed Hartle. And he used the term lethal mutations to describe a good idea that gets implemented in a way that actually prevents it from working, or maybe even makes it counterproductive. So, for example, one good example would be the work on collaborative or cooperative learning. So teachers hear about this, people are told, students will need to work together in a group when they're in the world of business, so they actually do cooperative, collaborative learning, and it actually lowers student achievement. It lowers student achievement because to be effective, cooperative learning needs to incorporate group goals and individual accountability. In other words, that each individual member of the group has to be accountable to the rest of the group for putting forward their best learning efforts. Now, we get that in the orchestra. One student playing a wrong note because they didn't practice harms the whole group's performance, group goals, and everybody knows who plays the wrong note, individual accountability. We get that in team sport, like rugby. One person missing a tackle harms the whole team's chances of winning, group goals, and everybody knows who missed the tackle. The trouble is, many teachers hearing about cooperative learning set up group tasks where one or two students in the group can do the work for the whole group. In which case, the reason that these lethal mutations happen is because people tell teachers to do things without telling them why. So Lawrence Stenhouse memorably said that many educational reforms treat teachers as intellectual navvies who are told where to dig but not why. And here's why that's important. No curriculum innovation can be implemented in a typical classroom in the way imagined by its inventor. You have to work around, you have to find a way of making it work. And if teachers don't understand why the thing was designed in the way it was designed, then they may make adjustments to make the thing less effective. So in terms of my own work on formative assessment, teachers using lollipop sticks, for example, to pick students at random, but then not replacing the sticks. So now you know, once you've answered a question, you're off the hook for the next 29 questions. Teachers picking the stick, announcing the pupil's name first, and then making up the question. So now the other students know it's not their turn to answer a question. So the point is, the reason for lollipop sticks is to increase engagement. But teachers implemented it in a way that actually did not increase engagement. And so lethal mutations are the problem. The solution is actually teachers have to understand the rationale behind these reforms, otherwise they can't implement them in smart ways. And too often we tell teachers what to do without telling them why, which is why we get lethal mutations. There are a couple of issues here. I think the first is just getting teachers to realize what the problem is. So in Wales and in many other countries now, or in most other countries, teachers need to make decisions like, do I need to go over this point one more time or do I go on to the next page? And they ask a question, they check for understanding, and they get an answer from the smartest kid in the room. And if that smart kid gives the correct answer, that teacher says good and moves on. So right now teachers are using responses from high achieving students to judge what's going on in the heads of the other students. So the big idea here is shifting from data-driven decision-making towards decision-driven data collection. Start with the decisions teachers need to make already. Do I need to go over this point one more time? And then think about what data would help them make that decision in a smarter way. And so first of all, hearing from all of the students in the group rather than just the usual suspects. And second, asking questions that are worth asking. So in secondary school science, don't ask, would your weight be the same on the moon? Pupils will get that right. Ask them, would their mass be the same on the moon? Because many students get that wrong because they haven't understood the distinction between mass and weight. In primary mathematics, rather than asking, which is bigger, 0.35 or 0.2, ask, which is bigger, 0.25 or 0.3? Many children think that 0.25 is bigger than 3.3 because 25 is bigger than 3. So it's those two things of better evidence as deeper evidence, good questions, better evidence as broader evidence, the whole group rather than the usual suspects. And the equation is simple. Better evidence leads to better decisions, leads to better learning. And so the first point here is getting teachers to understand you cannot possibly be making decisions that reflect the learning needs of the whole group if you're only hearing from the confident students. So that's the kind of responsive teaching idea. But the important point, as I made in my foreword to Harry's book, is that that's only part of the picture, because you also have to change the role of students as well, because they need to understand that it's their responsibility to manage their own learning. The second point, the sticking point if you like, is that getting teachers to adopt these practices is not an information problem, it's a habit change problem. And too often we think of professional development for teachers as telling them things they don't already know. And so we remind teachers about the research on wait time. Teachers know they don't wait long enough at the end of a question. Reminding teachers of wait time has about as much impact as reminding smokers of the harmful effects of smoking. It's not a knowledge problem, it's a habit change problem. And so for novice teachers, maybe they do need some information they don't yet possess. But for most teachers, we need to think about habit change as the major focus of professional development. And the reason it's particularly hard is because the teacher's existing habits are their greatest resource. It gets them through the day, but it makes change more difficult. So understanding that these habits are both assets and liabilities, and helping teachers just adapt these habits slowly to improve their practice. So that's the other thing that we've seen, is that typically people think that telling teachers what to do will make them better teachers, and it doesn't work because it's not a knowledge problem, it's a habit change problem. It's like trying to explain to somebody how to ride a bicycle. It doesn't work because it's not that kind of knowledge. It's not the kind of knowledge that can be written down. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that there is no such thing as a perfect assessment system. Any assessment system will involve trade-offs. And the trade-offs will depend partly on the purposes of the assessment, but partly in the context in which it's being implemented. So in cultures like Sweden, where there's relatively high trust in teachers, then you're going to be able to get far more acceptance of teacher assessment than you would in Wales, for example. So I think the first thing is to understand that there's just a series of trade-offs, and my argument is those trade-offs are better made explicitly by discussion at the outset rather than emerging as unintended consequences of decisions taken elsewhere. And there's a parable I like to, it's a short story by G.K. Chesterton. I don't know if you heard about Chesterton's fence. But the idea is there's a fence across a road, and somebody says, I don't see the point of this fence, let me tear it down. And Chesterton says, well, why was it put there? And the man says, I don't know. Well, in that case, I won't let you take it down. When you go away and think about it, if you can come back and tell me why it was put there, then I may allow you to destroy it. So the important point is we have to understand why things that we're doing were put there. And often in reform, people say, well, I don't see the point of this, I want to do something different. So here's the second insight, as well as the fact that there are always trade-offs, is that reformers are usually very clear about what it is the old system did badly and the new system will do better. You then need also to ask them, what will be worse if we adopt the changes you propose? And if they can't answer that question, or if they say there are none, they are actually not thinking through the issues deeply enough. The important point is, some things will be worse if we change. Be explicit about those and talk about them, and then we can make the trade-offs. So I think the whole idea of Chesterton's fence, this idea of things that have been in place for quite a while, probably have a purpose. It may not have been a strong purpose, it may no longer be a purpose that's useful, but you have to understand why things are the way they are before you try to change them. And I think that's really important in terms of assessment. Then, thinking about these trade-offs, I think there are 5 things that a good assessment system should try to achieve, and you can't do all 5. You will have to have more of one than another, and those things need to be discussed. So the first is that the assessment system needs to be distributed. In other words, you don't collect evidence right at the end on a hot day in June or July. You actually collect evidence throughout the whole course. But the assessment system also needs to be synoptic. Students have to be able to summarize and synthesize what they've been learning. Otherwise, you end up with the American system, where students do a piece of work for 2 or 3 weeks, they do a test on that, they get an A, and they get to keep the A even if they subsequently forget everything they knew to get the A. So you have to have some requirement for students to actually be assessed at the end of the course to show how they've integrated all the elements of the course. So for the first two requirements are distributed and synoptic, and those are clearly in tension. The third one is extensiveness. We have to be assessing everything, because if pressure on teachers to improve results in teachers not doing the things that aren't assessed, then I think we've got a problem. So in English, we need to assess speaking and listening as well as reading and writing. It's a pretty obvious argument in modern foreign languages, for example, but I think there's also an argument in mathematics. In Russia, for example, they often have oral assessments of mathematical thinking, where a student walks into a room and there's an examiner there and there's 3 cards on the table that the student chooses one of those, turns over and has to talk about that mathematical problem. So I think if we think being able to argue mathematically is important, then the assessment needs to include that. So the third requirement is extensiveness, which is in direct tension with the fourth one, which is manageable. So there's extra work involved for teachers, and of course the real problem with GCSE was that coursework was never coursework. Coursework was an additional requirement on top of the work of the course. So I think we have to think very carefully about the data collection being manageable, and then last of all, it has to be trusted. You have to build trust in the system for employers, parents, higher education institutions. So those 5 principles, I think, guide our thinking about summative assessment. And then the question is, to what extent do you want that summative assessment to inform practical teachers' judgments to serve a formative purpose? And I think I'm coming down on the side that it's very difficult to do that well. So I think the key thing is in secondary school, in years 10 and 11, we should be collecting evidence primarily for formative purposes, so we can make better adjustments to our teaching, but towards the end of the process, we actually synthesize the information and maybe then come up with a summative judgment. But the idea is that if you collect evidence primarily for formative purposes, you will always be able to aggregate it to serve a summative function. What you can't do is go the other way. You can't use data that was collected primarily for a summative purpose and work out what that child needs to do next. So I think what I see both in primary and secondary is teachers keeping records that actively help them teach. And you just go and ask a teacher, how do you use your mark book to improve your teaching? And they don't. Mark books are useful for writing school reports. And so I think that's the transformation we need. We need teachers running records to be things that are actually useful for the purpose of teaching, and that evidence can then be reanalyzed and resynthesized for a summative purpose towards the end of the course. But I think that's the crucial thing, is the formative purpose must come first. You know, basically we teach our students and we find out what they've learned. So, you know, whether you call what they've learned an output or an outcome doesn't seem to be terribly important to me. You know, we have a list or a specification of what it is we want our pupils to get better at as a result of some time in school. We do our best to actually achieve that, and we use some kind of assessment process to discover whether the changes we hoped would occur in our pupils have really taken place. So I think the starting point is to have a clear definition of what it is that you want students to get better at. And that's what doesn't happen right now. So let me give you an illustration. Here's the question. Can you assess historical thinking entirely with multiple choice tests? That's the question. Now, some people will answer yes, and some people will answer no. And that looks like a debate about assessment, but it's not. It's a debate about what you mean by being good at history. If you think history is about knowing facts and dates, then you think multiple choice questions are pretty nifty because you can assess a lot of facts and dates very quickly. And you think essay questions are actually bad because you're penalizing pupils with poor or slow handwriting. You're assessing things that are not to do with history. So the scores that they get on these assessments depend on things they shouldn't. If, on the other hand, you think that history is about describing and explaining historical events, then you think multiple choice questions underrepresent that goal, because they don't actually get at some of the important insights you want. And so they think that multiple choice tests are inadequate because they don't assess everything that's important, and that some kind of constructive response assessment is essential. Here's the important point. That debate surfaces when people argue about assessments. It looks like they're arguing about the adequacy of different methods of assessment. They're not. They're arguing about history. They're arguing about what it means to think historically. And too often we think that we're having a debate about assessment, but we're actually having a debate about the underlying, what psychologists would call, constructs. And here's the really important point. If you define the construct well, then assessment development should be a relatively technical matter, in that different people should be able to agree whether a particular assessment adequately assesses the construct you've defined. If you don't adequately define the construct, you give far too much power to the assessment developers. Assessment development becomes a values-laden process, and it comes down to the subjectivity of those assessors. And so good construct definition is essential to avoid giving the assessment developers too much power, and they end up assessing the things that they want to assess or they find easy to assess rather than the curriculum we intended at the outset. And construct definition is hard, but from your definition of what you want students to be good at, look at, are we getting all this? And you should be very clear to see that if you're relying on time-written examinations, you're not going to be able to assess a whole lot of things that you think are quite important. And so then there's an issue about how you weight those different components, but the important point is, let's be clear about what it is we want our student to be getting better at. Then assessment development is a technical process. Absent that, values intrude. There's a deeper problem there to do with assessment, because there's a curious paradox at the heart of assessment, and that is that we are not interested in our students' ability to do what we're testing them on. We're interested in our ability to speak about other things. So if I tell students there's going to be a 20-word spelling test at the end of the week, if I tell them the 20 words are going to come from a 1,000-word item bank, and I choose them randomly, then the score a child gets on the test is a good guide to how much they know of the words in the spelling bank, the word bank. But if I tell them which 20 words are going to be tested on Friday, the score tells me nothing about the items I didn't test. All I know about is that they can spell the words I said I was going to test them on. And so good assessment allows you to speak about things that weren't assessed. And there's a real tension here, because people like predictable assessments. People think that predictable assessments are fair. But the problem is, then, if you tell the students what you're going to test them on, then all you know is how well they did on the things you tested them on. You're unable to speak about anything else. So there's a real need for assessments to be assessing students on things that are less predictable, so that the results can be generalized in some sense to the things that you didn't assess. So the curious paradox of assessment is, from the things we assess, we want to draw conclusions about the things that were not assessed. And Alan Hansen calls this a difference between a literal and a representative assessment. So you might actually say, well, in military training, for example, the ability to strip down a rifle and reassemble it, is a pretty literal assessment. You're just interested in that. But whether they can do that in the barracks is not a good guide to whether they can do that knee-deep in a swamp under fire. So basically, any assessment is useful to the extent it allows you to draw conclusions about things that were not explicitly assessed. And that's the fundamental challenge. That quote, "pedagogy trumps curriculum," is actually relying on a specific definition of pedagogy and a specific definition of curriculum, which is why it's often taken out of context. So it turns out to be much more difficult to separate curriculum from pedagogy than most people imagine. So curriculum theorists typically distinguish between 3 levels of the curriculum, which is the intended, the implemented, and the achieved curriculum. And so what I'm saying really is that the achieved curriculum is actually a matter of pedagogy. It's the intended curriculum that the pedagogy trumps. It's not the achieved curriculum, because at the level of the achieved curriculum, essentially curriculum is pedagogy. What pupils learn is how things are taught, how the teacher brings them to life, for example. And so, the quote is not inaccurate in that sense, but it depends on a particular interpretation of curriculum and pedagogy. And it's interesting to note, I mean, I've looked into this, so you do have some people saying that pedagogy is part of curriculum, and some people saying that curriculum is part of pedagogy. So you have to be very clear what you're talking about. In America, for example, curriculum just means textbooks. We're changing the curriculum just means we're changing the textbooks. So these terms admit of a wide variety of interpretations, which we need to be clear about before we start drawing strong conclusions. But yeah, it is taken out of context, and it would have been helpful if I'd phrased it in a way that meant that people couldn't take it out of context. So most curricula specified by national and state governments are too full. My hunch is the reason for this is people can't bear the thought that any pupils have time on their hands, so they make sure there's enough stuff to keep the fastest learning pupils busy for the whole year. The work of Benjamin Bloom and John Carroll back in the 60s and 70s showed that the fastest learning child in a class is probably learning about 4 times the speed of the slowest learning child in that class, if it's a genuine mixed ability class. So the fact is, there's way too much stuff in the curriculum to teach well to the vast majority of students in the class. The question is what you do about it. And you could teach everything, you could meter it out and teach everything at a rate that allows you to cover the entire curriculum by the end of the year, paying no attention to whether students are learning it or not. That's what I think is immoral. I think teaching something, irrespective of whether the students are learning it, is logically consistent but immoral choice. I think teachers need to be thinking about how can I take more of the class with me, and then there's a trade-off. So first of all, not all content is equal. So I talk to science teachers and they say that the phases of the moon is very interesting to. I used to teach phases of the moon. I used to love teaching it because I did great with teaching it with tennis balls and torches. But you know what? If students don't get this, nothing bad happens. There's nothing coming up in the next 3 years that requires the children to understand this. The fact that matter is made of very small particles, different story. In primary school, place value, really important. Roman numerals, not quite so important. So in helping teachers make a decision about this, first of all, accept that the curriculum is too full. You could only cover it all by ignoring at least half the class, leaving them behind. Just being reckless about whether they're getting it or not. So you have to make choices about things to include and things to leave out. And so the first thing is, how consequential is this? Is it essential? So, in maths, you might have to take into account what the science department needs in year 7 and year 8 in terms of equations and graphs. So the maths department can't make its decision independent of the other departments in the school because the science teachers might need this. And if the science teachers teach it, they may teach it in a way that's different from the way that you taught it, which will confuse the students even further. So, how important is it? How consequential is it? And then the 2 questions that Jerome Bruner asked in his work on the spiral curriculum: is it important that students know this? And is it important that students know this now? So his criterion for including things in the curriculum was that it would be useful to the adult to have studied this in school, and that the student would be significantly disadvantaged as an adult if they do not study it now. He said, if it doesn't pass those 2 tests, it's just cluttering up the curriculum. Now there's a second problem here, which is you've got a government-specified curriculum. And so the teachers are in the position of having to give less emphasis to things they have to teach. But I think the important point here is that there is too much, and we have to recognize that there's too much, and therefore teaching everything is deliberately abandoning 70, 80% of the class, and I think that's immoral. That's what I meant by it's immoral. It's immoral to teach the entirety of an overfull curriculum. I think that it's helpful to think about the main purpose of curriculum as building the contents of long-term memory. Now, when I use phrases like long-term memory, people object, saying it's more than memorization, and of course it is. Long-term memory is where we store everything we don't need to relearn how to do. So if you can ride a bicycle, it's in long-term memory. And the point is that there are lots of things we need to do in school. So I'm quite sympathetic to some of Guy Claxton's arguments about the fact that we need our children leaving us excited about continuing learning, because we can't teach everything that they need to learn for the rest of their lives, because most of it hasn't been discovered or invented yet. So no matter how much we teach our children, if they leave us at the age of 18 with the desire for learning extinguished, we will have failed them. We need our 18-year-olds leaving school with the same passion for learning that the 5-year-old arrived with. And so there's a place for things that just maintain that excitement, that enthusiasm, that curiosity. But there's also a place for making sure that students can learn to do things that are things that they would not learn for themselves. So in science, for example, the idea that when I'm grabbing a cold door handle, a cold metal door handle on a cold day, the best way to think about that is not as the cold coming into my hand, but that the handle is conducting heat away from my hand, and because metal conducts better than wood, that's why the metal handle feels colder, even though the temperature is the same. That's not something you would guess for yourself. You need to be taught that explicitly. And so I think that a lot of what we need to be doing, certainly in secondary school, but to a certain extent in primary school as well, is not so much teaching children to think, but to give them more things to think with. And that needs, so we need a systematic construction of what psychologists call schema. Maybe you could call them the situation action pairs. When I see this, I know the best thing to do is this. And so that seems to me, the major purpose of curriculum is to systematically create those repositories of situation action pairs, schemas. You can call it long-term, you can call it content knowledge, but the idea is that the major purpose of curriculum is to build that up so that students learn to think about things in history in terms of cause and effect and in terms of chronology. In mathematics, they learn to think about things in terms of identity and inverse. You know, the idea that adding 0 has the same effect as multiplying by 1. You know, the same kinds of things with different mathematical operations. Those things need to be drawn out explicitly by the teacher. Otherwise the pupils, well, let me be clear. Some pupils will discover this for themselves. The problem is that for many pupils, it'll take too long. And so therefore I think we have to think very carefully about the kinds of things that people advocate. Now there's a role for keeping students excited about learning, so there's always a trade-off there, and I would certainly trade off a bit of progress in terms of content knowledge in favor of having a bit more excitement about learning. But we have to be clear about the fact that we still need to develop those aspects, those thinking tools, that content knowledge. And it's different in every discipline. And that's why I think the 21st century skills agenda is so dangerous. Because you ask a historian and a mathematician to describe historical thinking, they say very similar things. So people conclude that it's just one skill, but it's not, because no amount of training people to think critically in history has any impact on their ability to think critically in mathematics. Critical thinking is a bundle of superficially similar skills that relies on different cognitive processes in different disciplines. And so we can often get seduced by this idea of teaching these so-called 21st century skills. And that's why I think their main use is as audit tools for our curriculum. So when we look at our maths curriculum, are we doing communication and collaboration and critical thinking and creativity and problem solving? And we apply the same checklist to our science curriculum and our history curriculum, making sure that the curriculum is appropriately broad. That is why I think 21st century skills are useful, but they're not in any real sense transferable, which is what it's often interpreted as being. But ultimately, so to come back to your original question, I think teachers do need to be involved in curriculum design or development at some level, because teachers create curriculum every day. So let me give you an example. I saw two teachers teaching Ohm's law, and one did it as an equation on a graph on the relationship between voltage and resistance. Another teacher asked the students to investigate what the resistance of a 60-watt light bulb was. And it's a small thing, but that teacher was trying to connect it to pupils' lives. They've all seen 60-watt light bulbs. The idea that what you're doing in the science classroom might actually connect to your life outside school, I think, was insightful. And I think that probably made more sense. But the point is that that teacher had the idea of connecting the content to the students. That teacher created that curriculum idea. So that, I think good teachers create curriculum every day by making the content accessible and meaningful to their students. So in that sense, I think every teacher needs to be involved. But I don't think every teacher needs to be involved all the time in every single aspect. So for example, let's take two micro examples. Primary school. Teachers will teach figurative language, onomatopoeia, personification, hyperbole, simile. What's the best order to teach that in? That's the investigation we need to have. So basically, teachers need to try out teaching these things in a different sequence, and then once you've got that idea, you share it with other teachers, so that they don't need to reinvent the wheel. Here's our experience. We think that for our kids, starting off with alliteration is easier because it's just a much more accessible concept. And I just don't know whether that's true or not. But the important point is you discuss that micro-curriculum level. In mathematics, in secondary, what's the best order to teach things in terms of areas of polygons? Triangle, rectangle, square, parallelogram, or trapezium? Turns out that most teachers teach square, then rectangle, then triangle, then parallelogram, then trapezium. In Japan, they don't do the square, it's a rectangle. Don't need it. Second, they do the parallelogram. Why? Because you can always fit two triangles together to get a parallelogram. You can only fit two triangles together to get a rectangle if they're right-angle triangles. So the learning progression is simpler if you actually do parallelogram before triangles. Just that kind of insight. Once you get that, that can be shared, across the whole country very quickly. Teach parallelograms before triangles. And so there's no advantage in teachers reinventing the wheel at that level. And so that, I think, is we could do a better job. No surgeon makes his own scalpels. And so I think there's a preciousness in education that every teacher should be involved in designing their own resources. But in most cases, in most of the things that you're teaching, actually the best thing for one kid is almost always the best thing for another kid, once you take into account prior achievement. So there's not much evidence that students differ in their, we know that learning styles don't really help very much, but there's not much evidence of anything other than prior achievement. Once you know what a child already knows, you know pretty much everything you need to know to teach them efficiently. And so having those kinds of ideas shared, we need teaching to be a job that humans can do rather than superhumans. And I think there's a lot of angst about workload right now. Well, part of that is caused by this idea that teachers should be preparing all their teaching resources. I think teachers should be curating resources, and I think that should be done at a departmental level in secondary schools. So one teacher might actually research angles and graphs, and then all the teachers teach it, not because it's the best, but because it's good enough. And the extra progress you get from spending more time on that by every teacher doing their own thing is not the best use of that teacher's time. So it's not that, I'm very happy to admit that if teachers designed all their own resources, they might be a bit better than commercially produced resources. I'm not sure that's true, but it could be. But I'm sure it's not of the best use of that teacher's time. So it comes down to this concept of opportunity cost. Every hour that teachers spend on one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. So the question for me is, given that we have this hour of teacher time, what use of that hour is going to have the biggest benefit for the pupils? If we keep our focus on that question, then we end up making much smarter decisions than just going for one of these extreme positions like textbooks or only teacher-produced resources. Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that the terms summative and formative make no sense when applied to actual assessments, because the same assessment can be used both formatively and summatively. So I think the starting point here is to realize that formative and summative are best thought of as descriptions of the use that we make of the information. So if I'm preparing kids for a GCSE and I give them a mock exam, then I might look at the questions they got right and the questions they got wrong and decide this is what I need to do with the whole class. So there you've got an assessment designed entirely for a summative purpose, GCSE, but used in a formative way. So the first recognition is that summative and formative are descriptions of the uses we make of the information, not of the information itself. But then I think we have to think about, what are our models of progression? And I think there are basically 3 dimensions of progression. And they're characterized by different school subjects. So what does it mean to get, to make progress? In English and history, it's generally better. Progression equals better. In other words, you can ask all the children what were the causes of the First World War, and all the students get the same question, but the progression comes in how far they actually take the argument. In mathematics, progression is usually harder. So it's basically how far you get through a test, where the questions are arranged in order of difficulty. And the third dimension is progression is more independent. So you can actually give the same task and you can support some students by actually giving them additional support and actually add extra challenges to other students to actually really push their understanding. So I think those 3 ideas of progression as better, harder, and more independent helps teachers think about this. The other thing to recognize is that there's no model of progression that is independent of the order in which you teach things. See, if you teach sequences in a different order, students will have different models of progression. And as George Box, the statistician, famously said, all models are wrong, some are useful. So I think it's important to think about whether the progressions are universal or just consequences of curriculum progression. So for example, in mathematics, I think most people would agree that you shouldn't teach multiplication until after you've taught addition. So that's a pretty clear progression. It's logically required. And Brenda Denver, in her PhD work in the 1980s, came up with 2 definitions of progression. One is that it must be empirical. It must be the case that any student who can do this can do the things in the earlier level of the progression. And it must be also theoretical. There must be a good reason why the students who can do this could always do the thing that were further down the progression. I think those 2 things are quite helpful. But then in articulating our models of progression, I think we need to understand that, they're not as universal as we think. So we would typically teach multiplication before division in primary school because we think it's easier. It's easier computationally, it's not easier conceptually. Turns out that it's easier to understand division as a process than it is to understand multiplication as a process. The CSMS team in Chelsea in the 1970s showed this by asking children to construct stories concerning number facts. So 12 divided by 4 equals 3. Tell us a story about that. There were 12 sweets, there were 4 children, they shared them out and they got 3 each. The same children could not construct a story for 3 times 4 equals 12. They say Jane had 3 sweets and John had 4 sweets and they times them. So it turns out that conceptually division is easier to understand than multiplication. So you might choose to teach division as a concept before you teach multiplication. It's not an absolute hierarchy, and therefore teachers teaching things in different sequences would have different models of progression. So the important thing is there's no model of progression that is independent of the sequence in which things are taught. What it may be helpful to do is to identify important stopping off points. So you've got the goal, where we want our students. So this is what I call the architecture of an assessment system. You've got where we want to get our kids to get to by the age of 16 or 18. You've got the typical trajectory taken by most pupils under the traditional or typical kind of teaching. And then we have the important checkpoints along the way. And, would it be useful to know if the child has reached this point? And we used to actually try to, back in the 1980s, I and many others tried to use Piaget and Vygotskian levels of thinking, and it went nowhere. It just didn't work. So what is quite useful is the solo taxonomy, the structure of observed learning outcomes. And so you can actually see this applied, what's the cause of the First World War? The attack on Pearl Harbor. So that's completely wrong. That's what they would call pre-structural. What's the cause of the First World War? The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. That is a unistructural response. You've got one thing, but it was really just the trigger. What was the cause of the First World War? Alliances, militarism, nationalism. Then you've got those three separate causes, what they would call multistructural. And then if pupils can also identify the links between these components, that would be what they call relational. So the idea of what gets better is helpful in terms of giving feedback. Because if a student says, well, to the question, what was the cause of the First World War, the Archduke assassination, were there any other causes? If the student identifies 3 or 4 causes, we say, what's the connection between these causes? So the idea of that solo taxonomy is that it gives a teacher some questions to ask in terms of promoting the next steps. So I think those kinds of very high-level models can be useful in discursive subjects like English and history. In mathematics, usually progression is harder, and therefore it's just making sure they can do this next step before they can actually do the step afterwards. So you have different models of progression for different purposes. Here's the really important point. The grain size for subjects that use progression equals harder is much smaller than the grain size for the subjects that use progression equals better. In terms of what gets better at pupils' writing in English literature, for example, there's not much point in assessing more than once every 6 months because the change is so slow. But in mathematics, we need to know whether students can actually factorize quadratic expressions before we go on to polynomial division, for example. And so there's a need to recognize that the optimal grain size needs to go with the grain of teachers' work. And too often that's missed, where we try to actually come up with the same model of progression for every subject. The other thing to say, of course, is that actually, although I mentioned these subjects as being exemplar cases, each subject embodies both kinds of progression. So, spelling and punctuation, there is a right and wrong answer. And so in that aspect of English looks more like mathematics. And in mathematical investigation, investigate the mathematics of a chessboard, progression looks more like progression in English. It's about better and the sophistication of the arguments, not how hard or advanced the skills demonstrated are. So it's about understanding that every subject embodies both of these models of progression and being clear about, but ultimately, it's about teachers answering the question, what is it that gets better when a pupil gets better at this subject? And it's usually multidimensional. So I think design and technology and history are probably exemplar cases here, because what gets better at D&T is, first of all, the design of technological thinking, but also becoming adept at working with more resistant materials. In history, students become better at the core ideas of cause and effect and chronology and conflicting documentary sources, provenance and all those other kinds of ideas. But it also needs to go hand in hand with an understanding of facts and dates. So my favorite example of this is, when was the Treaty of London signed? One pupil says 1604. Another pupil says, I don't know, but it must have been early in the 17th century, because by 1609 there was a settlement established at Jamestown, Virginia, and previous settlements had actually failed because they hadn't been able to get supplies from England due to the attacks by the Spanish Armada. And although the Armada was defeated in 1588, the attacks weren't really resolved until the Treaty of London. So it must have been sometime before 1608. Now the important point is this. The first student knows the correct answer. The second student knows why it matters. He doesn't know the correct answer, but he understands how the pieces fit together. And so the point is that in history, it's interesting because you've got a combination of cause and effect, but it has to be argued within a framework of facts and dates. Well, I think the first thing is that the presence of high-stakes assessments at the ends of key stages of learning do improve student achievement, because they create alignment. They create alignment between teachers and students, for example. You know, if there isn't a goal out there, it's like the coach trying to help the athlete clear the high jump bar at 2 meters. So, you know, in the absence of some sort of high-stakes assessment, you have to realize you're going to get a lot of positives, because you don't get that kind of teaching to the test, but you're going to also lose some things in terms of the alignment of the system. So it comes back to this idea of trade-offs. So as I said earlier, high-stakes assessments improve student achievement, even on things that are not tested on the assessment. Unfortunately, they tend to come with negatives, which in every case I've examined so far, outweigh the positives. So, you know, I think it's an open question as to whether you can have the benefits of a high-stakes accountability system that is on balance better than not having it. I'd like to think it might be possible, but you have to think about those 5 principles of synoptic, distributed, extensive, manageable, and trusted that I mentioned earlier. The reason that we have teaching to the test being a problem is because the test doesn't capture what we want and value. What we need are assessments worth teaching to. If the assessments embodied everything we cared about, we wouldn't mind that teachers taught to the test because they were doing everything we wanted them to do. So the difficulty is that, if you like, the invalidity of the system is that the accountability measures only sample a limited proportion of the things that we say we value. And in that situation, you will always get those perverse incentives. And, you know, it's not just teachers, it's also kids. Kids will, you know, is this on the test? And so, you know, you can actually improve achievement by increasing the pressure on teachers, but then teachers will look harder for the loopholes. And so, you know, it's like putting ice cubes in the mouth of somebody with a fever. You put a thermometer in their mouth, oh, the fever's gone. No, you've changed the index. You haven't changed the thing that it was indicating. And so, you know, the difficulty is to be, if the stakes are too high, then people will resort to kind of quick fixes, the teaching to the test, narrowing the curriculum. And we're certainly seeing that in England. So we used to have, in literature, students reading books other than the set books. And then we had them just reading the set books. Now they don't even read all the set book. They actually just read the bits of the set book that the teacher thinks are likely to come up in the examination. So, you know, teachers are smart, kids are smart. You just have to look at what incentives are we creating for teachers and students, assuming that if there are any possible loopholes, they will find them. Assuming that, how do we design our curriculum? Would this system that we're proposing create perverse incentives for teachers to increase their students' scores in a way that we didn't approve of? That seems to be the kind of touchstone that we have to use in terms of the assessment. But I am keen to incorporate more evidence. We can't rely on evidence at the end of the course in an exam. We have to collect other evidence. The question is, how do we do that in a way that is manageable and trusted? And again, no simple answer, but that, I think, is the thing we ought to be aiming for. You could have a kind of within-school moderation process, and we know how to do that quite well, actually. So the idea is this: you have regional meetings, in Wales probably do it on a county basis, and then, here's the incentive: if the teachers are being too generous in their grading, every piece of coursework in that school is downgraded by half a grade or whatever. In other words, it's up to the head of department in the secondary school to make sure that the processes are being applied consistently, so that if they do pick up a piece of work that's been too leniently graded, it means that the whole school was actually missing the standards. And you improve this over time. You might actually say, well, let it go this year, but next year you need to be a bit stricter. You can build in exemplification portfolios. You can have teachers attending regional meetings to make sure that the counties aren't diverging. There are lots of ways of doing that. But if we think of the process of moving towards a process of standardization rather than moderation. So moderation means putting right grades that were wrongly awarded. Standardization means working on the system so that teachers don't award the wrong grades because they understand the standards. And so, moving from moderation, which you need in the short term, towards a process of exemplification, visa, and then you can also then evolve the criteria for GCSE. So, for example, you might have examples as a curriculum evolves to bring in more collaborative or cooperative work. You might actually say, well, here's an example of a piece of work that is worth the highest grade for the following reasons. And so you can actually build in these models, and getting teachers to explore why this piece of work is reckoned to be good would be a very powerful form of teacher professional development, helping them understand. It also helps you define the discipline. So in mathematical investigation, for example, you'll have some teachers saying, I think this is great, and another teacher saying, I don't think this is mathematics. And then you're having that construct debate again. You're actually arguing about what is it to get better at mathematics. And again, very valuable professional development.